I'm going to try something new in terms of fighting game content. In this video, I want to go in depth about a particular fighting game mechanic. Not in terms of strategy or fighting game philosophy. This isn't going to be another rock, paper, scissors reduction of the genre, but rather more of a deeper dive into the inner workings of a fighting game's code. Okay, hold up. Don't worry, you're not going to need a computer science degree to enjoy this, but couldn't hurt. In my previous video, I asked if there was any topics that you'd like me to cover, to which one of you replied, "What about that Frameskip thingy?" And another, understandably so, said no to that idea. So let's talk about turbo speeds in Capcom fighters. Now I realize a good chunk of you may not have even been alive for this type of turbo.
Okay, so
Back in the day, Street Fighter II had 5 arcade iterations that released from 1991 to 1994. Street Fighter II: The World Warrior kicked off the fighting game craze of the 90s, followed by the most popular arcade board of the series, Champion Edition, in 1992, the height of Street Fighter Mania. But was that what you were actually playing? Because Hyper Fighting was released later that same year as an upgrade kit to be installed into Champion Edition boards. It was the first to be turboed, introducing faster gameplay. Super Street Fighter II in 1993 then moved the series to the CPS2 hardware, updating the game's audio and graphics, but slowing the game back down to the speeds of Champion Edition, taking the wind out of the franchise's sails in more ways than one. But then, our fighting game savior came to bless us all, descending from the heavens to rescue the series. Actually by the time Super Turbo was released, the lights had been dimming for a while on Street Fighter II's popularity, and ST didn't really do much to change that, despite those who weren't alive at the time insisting otherwise. But it too was turboed, and was the first Capcom fighting game released in arcades to feature an adjustable speed setting. Arcade operators now had the option to set the speed the game ran at in the system configuration. 4 different speeds. Turbo 1 through Turbo 4. These turbo speeds seemed to be something only Capcom did, and this trend of selectable game speeds continued for the rest of their fighting games released on the CPS2 and Namio system. Darkstalkers, the Versus series, the Alpha series, among others. And when given the option, it seemed that most players preferred the sped up gameplay that turbo speeds offered. But how was it all working? What was Capcom doing to speed up the gameplay of its fighters? In trying to understand turbo speeds, I came across very few sources of information on the topic. The earliest one I could find was a blog by Maj on his site sonichurricane.com from March 2nd, 2010. In the process of making combo videos, some of which featured at past EVO events, he and others would post random findings in the forums and blogs of another one of Maj's sites, combovid.com. One of the contributors to that site went by the name of Dammit, and his personal blog from 2010 to 2012 was the second source of information I found on turbo speeds. Their explanations lined up exactly. Here's how they believed it worked. I'm going to use Street Fighter Alpha 2 and its code for the remainder of this video to break down turbo speeds. Alpha 2 has 3 different speeds: normal, Turbo 1, and Turbo 2. On normal speed, the game's internal frame rate matches the game's displayed frame rate of 60 frames per second. The game processes a frame internally, then draws it to the screen, and does this for every frame. This is just how every video game ever works. As shown, Chun-Li's standing light punch has 2 frames of startup and is active on the 3rd for 4 frames. Now let's take a look at how the game behaves at Turbo 2, the default speed of Alpha 2 and the one it's most commonly played at. According to Dammit, Alpha 2's 3 different speed settings have a frame skip pattern like this, with normal speed having 0 frame skipping. And we can see Turbo 2 runs at a 333 frame skip pattern. Okay, so what's a frame skip pattern, and furthermore, what even is a frame skip? A frame skip is when a frame is processed internally, but not drawn to the screen. To a player, visually, the frame was skipped. So for a frame skip pattern of 333, this simply means that the game draws 3 frames to the screen, then skips 1, draws 3 frames, then skips 1, and so on. This changes our diagram a bit. A typical frame is processed, then drawn to the screen. But when a frame skip happens, the frame is processed and is not drawn to the screen, then continues to process the next frame in the span of one displayed frame. Two internal frames get processed by the game, but only one of them is drawn to the screen. So internally, the game is now running at a faster rate than its displayed rate. This has the effect of making everything except for music and sounds faster. They claim that even though a frame is skipped and not drawn to the screen, everything in the game continues to happen, just behind the scenes, resulting in all the frame data that happens at normal speed remaining unchanged when played at turbo speeds. Chun-Li's standing light punch still has 2 frames of startup and 4 active frames, despite you not seeing them all. You may only see 1 frame of startup and only 3 active frames. It all depends on which frames get skipped. Another thing they claim is that the game also skips over input opportunities as it skips over frames. If true, this would mean that 1 frame links would not be possible if the frame needed for the input was the skipped frame. And on Turbo 2, that would mean 25% of the time. I've also heard theories from others. Some have told me things like they believe the entire frame is skipped, internal logic and all. There are a few ideas floating around, and it's left me and others with some lingering questions about how exactly turbo speeds work. So I got in contact with Madge to see if I could get some answers. He was kind enough to jump on a call with me and hear out my questions about a blog he had written over a decade ago. Madge was sort of the spearhead for tool-assisted combo videos in the West, with inspiration from Japanese VHS tapes of the like. It later led him to help work on the strategy guide for Capcom Fighting Evolution, where he was given more tools that allowed him to do things like frame step, a process that we'll use later in the video. His primary goal was to make entertaining combo videos as part of group projects, and in doing so, he would come across oddities in the games while playing on turbo speeds that he'd post to his blogs. Naturally, the group would chalk up missing these harder links to human error, until programmable PS1 pads imported from Japan made it more clear that something else was going on. So through observations, lots of testing, and forum discussions while making these tool-assisted videos, they came up with a theory as to how turbo speeds were affecting the game. Dammit then seemed to run with the concept on his personal blog. I asked if Maj had dug into any code trying to prove this, but he said it was all done through observations of player interaction with the game. So let's break this down one element at a time and see if we can't provide enough evidence to prove how turbo speeds work once and for all. I'm going to keep the code talk relatively light, but it is necessary to show to better understand and make sense of what's happening under the hood. I plan to present the code in a very digestible way, so all levels of coding knowledge, even non-existent, will hopefully find interesting. For those that are curious, I'm running the US version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 in a MAME emulator with the debugger tools. I do things in the game, look at what changes in memory, make educated guesses on what is stored where, then try using that to reverse engineer the game's assembly code. It's a tedious process, there's a lot of trial and error and testing of assumptions, but it can be a very fun and rewarding puzzle to try and solve. And in doing so, I've found a lot of new information about Alpha 2 that I plan to share. Let's start out simple and show the Frameskip patterns in action. I'm going to spare you the long process of how I arrived here, but this is the game's main loop. The game runs this loop once per frame. Each one of these lines is a subroutine, 6 in total. Simply put, a subroutine is just a function call. They handle things like processing inputs, collision detection, damage calculations, etc. We'll dive into exactly how some of these work later on and possibly more in depth in another video, but for now let's focus on the very first line of code. This line takes what's stored at memory address FF8081 and adds 1 to it. So what's stored at this address? Well, Capcom has a pattern of storing certain types of data in 1 kilobyte chunks. Neutral game information, like the timer for rounds, starting at memory address FF8000. Player 1 information at FF8400, and player 2 information starting at FF8800. Things like player health, meter, or which side of the screen they're facing are stored here, among many other things related to each player. If player 1's health is stored here, just add 400 hex to the memory address to find it in player 2's information. So, knowing this storage trend, we can make assumptions about data depending on where it's stored. FF8881 falls within the neutral game data. And seeing as the very first thing that happens in a new frame is incrementing this by 1, it's a pretty safe assumption that this is where the game stores its internal frame count. Luckily, MAME also shows the display frame count and increments it every time a frame is drawn to the screen. With both the internal and display frame counts visible, let's see how the game behaves on normal speed. We'll set a breakpoint here, so the code will stop anytime this line is executed. Okay, so the frame counts seem to be completely synced. For every internal frame processed by the game, a frame is also drawn to the screen, just as we expected. Now let's do the same thing but with the game set to Turbo 2. Both the internal and the display frame count incremented, both incremented again and again. Hey, the internal frame count incremented, but the display didn't. I'll continue and see if we can't find a pattern. 1, 2, 3, skipped. 1, 2, 3, skipped. Just as we expected. The 333 frame skip pattern for Turbo 2. As we go through this process, we can make note of other changes we notice happening in memory. This address stuck out to me as I compared the internal and displayed frame counts. Every time a frame was skipped, it was set to FF, and 00 when a frame wasn't skipped. Turns out, the first subroutine in the game's main loop is just to check if the current frame needs to be skipped and sets this memory address accordingly. First, it checks if the previous frame was skipped. If so, it sets the flag to 00 so that it doesn't ever skip 2 frames in a row. Then it checks if the game is currently in an active fight. This memory address will be set to 1 if so. Frame skipping doesn't occur outside of a match because it would cause all animations to speed up and that would look weird. Then it looks up the frame skip data and puts it into register D0. Okay, but that doesn't look anything like our frame skip pattern of 333. Well, not yet at least. It also grabs the internal frame count and puts it into register D1, but only the first hex digit. The final step, the BTST instruction, this takes the second operand, our frame skip data, and converts it to binary. Then it takes the first operand, the first hex digit of our internal frame count, and uses it as a lookup index. If it's a 0, then it's a normal frame. But if it's a 1, it's a skipped frame. Since this index is in hex, it ranges from 0 to F. And voila, our frame skip pattern of 333 appears, written in binary. So the devs would write out whatever frame skip pattern they wanted in 1s and 0s, then translate it to hex to store in memory. According to Damit's blog, he tediously calculated all of these frame skip patterns by observing how the match timer would count down at different speeds, but noted that it was difficult for games where stages had impact on the game's performance. Turns out, if he just knew where to look in memory, Capcom had cleverly encoded their frame skip patterns. So the first 2 things the main loop does is increment the internal frame count, then checks if the Frameskip flag should be set or not. We should see where it checks the flag and what it does with that info. The Frameskip flag is only checked in 2 spots. The first spot is within the 4th subroutine, and if it's set to skip this frame, it skips over a large chunk of code. Let's make the code think it's always skipping this frame and see what happens when this portion of code is skipped. Turns out, the code it skips over is responsible for updating a bunch of the game's sprites. It updates the sprite's positions on screen and what frame of animation it should be on, including the life and meter bars, and it's all code that is unnecessary to execute if the current frame isn't going to be drawn to the screen. Keep in mind, these updates don't affect hitbox positions or anything gameplay related, just the visuals of the sprites. We know this because when we let the code go back to normal, everything we've done is all accounted for. Seeing as how 2 internal frames need to be processed in the time span of 1 drawn frame, Capcom knew that skipping unnecessary code would help speed up the process to meet the tighter window. The second and last spot the Frameskip flag is checked is at the very beginning of the last subroutine. If it's set, it exits out of the subroutine immediately, skipping it altogether. What's this subroutine responsible for? Well, drawing the frame to the screen. After all the game logic is processed, the last thing that's done is drawing the frame to the screen, which is all skipped when a Frameskip flag is set. If updating the sprites and drawing the frame to the screen are the only two places where code is skipped, that would suggest that all game logic is still internally processed, even for skipped frames. Okay, that's enough code for now. So we've seen that parts of code are skipped when a frame skip happens, but does it actually process the game's logic for those skipped frames? Remember those that told me that not only is a skipped frame not drawn to the screen, but that they believed it skipped internal processing altogether? Well, in Alpha 2, Charlie has a very unique attack, his Crouching Fierce. It bizarrely has a single active frame. That's it, just one. Somebody was once complaining about this move and said that it would sometimes completely whiff due to frame skipping on turbo speeds. That if the one active frame that it had landed on the frame that was skipped, it wouldn't hit the opponent. So let's tackle that theory. This should be easy enough to test without even looking at the code. If this was true, we'd expect to see Charlie's Crouching Fierce to whiff about 25% of the time when playing at Turbo 2 speeds, because the 333 frame skip pattern skips every fourth frame. Well, as you can see, it never whiffs. I've done this move hundreds of times, and it hit 100% of the time. If the skipped frame didn't process any internal logic like they claimed, we surely would have seen it whiff by now. With that, Maj and Damit's theories hold true. Even when a frame is skipped and isn't drawn to the screen, the game still internally processes it, which means the frame data that we see on normal speeds is exactly the same frame data that is internally processed on turbo speeds, regardless if you're seeing them on your screen or not. So far, we've proved the differing internal and external frame rates, the frame rate skip patterns, and the fact that skipped frames are still internally processed. The last thing we need to uncover is how inputs are handled during skipped frames. More specifically, whether or not the skipped frames allow for an opportunity for inputs. Skipped frames not allowing for an opportunity for inputs already seems like a unanimously agreed upon idea from everything that I've read and heard from people on the topic, or so I thought. A few months after I started looking into turbo speeds in Capcom fighting games, an interesting wrinkle to the turbo speed saga unfolded. When John Choi DM'd me an article dating back to May 11th, 2017, titled Expert Course, The School of Turbo. It was posted to Capcom's official site as part of a series of Street Fighter seminars written by someone under the alias Bug of Skillsmith. Bug produced combo videos in the 90s and has been credited in many Capcom games as a test player under the same alias. He showed up again around the time of these articles, but has since gone dark. In his introduction to the Street Fighter seminars, he wrote,
"There may be some among you who know my real identity, and if so, I'd be grateful if you could help me keep it secret. I've always wanted a repository of this sort of info, and I'm honored to be able to contribute, especially seeing as this is an official page."
Finally, a source from an official Capcom site on how exactly turbo speeds work. What is turbo? In past Capcom games, you could choose a quicker game speed. This is referenced to as turbo. Someone said this to me in the past. Sometimes with the turbo setting on, important frames get skipped and my combo doesn't connect. However, I've had my doubts about this theory for a while now. Seems like they heard about Maj and Damit's theory about how skipped frames don't allow opportunities for inputs. I had a chance to talk to Mr. M, who served as a programmer and was able to get answers to my questions, as well as the finer details. So from my understanding, this is an article written by a former Capcom playtester who interviewed a Capcom programmer to explain the finer details of how turbo works. Perfect. Just what I've been looking for. Ultimately, no frames are skipped under turbo settings. He goes on to explain that there are two different patterns of turbo processing. Pattern A, used by Street Fighter II, and Pattern B, used by all other Capcom fighting games. Since we're focusing on Alpha 2 in this video, we'll take a look at pattern B. And well, it's exactly like Maj and Dammit described, except for one detail. While Turbo has no effect on the game's internal processing, the reduction of real time for the processing frame has an effect on the player's necessary input accuracy and requires them to have faster reaction speeds. Simply put, the time you have to visually confirm your links and combos decreases, but the input will still be accepted. The article on Capcom's official site claims that even when a frame isn't drawn to the screen, it always accepts inputs, and therefore all that's needed is an adjustment in timing to hit those one-frame links. Unfortunately, there's not a practical way to test this with just a controller and a copy of the game. So, back to the code we go. Let's talk about how Alpha 2 handles player inputs. We can think about it in terms of 3 input phases: raw, converted, and relative. Raw inputs are signals from the controller hardware to the game's hardware available when the game's logic polls for inputs. Player 1s are stored in memory here. Converted inputs are when the game translates the raw inputs to up, down, left, right, and their corresponding buttons by assigning them a numerical value. For instance, down is 4 and left is 2, so down left would be those values added together. The converted inputs are stored here, within the player data section of memory of which we saw earlier. But the game's logic doesn't care about left and right, it only cares about forward and back. So the inputs need to be translated once more, relative to which way the character is facing. Additionally, the inputs of the previous frame are also kept track of, and are used by the game to distinguish if a button was pressed, held down, or being released by comparing its current state to the state that it was in on the previous frame. These 2 inputs are stored right next to each other in memory. So on a normal frame, an input is pressed, the game polls for new inputs, and it's translated to relative inputs for processing. But how does it work on a skipped frame? Let's find out. An input is pressed, the game polls for new inputs, and it's translated to relative inputs for processing, same as a normal frame. Okay, but let's continue on to the next frame. We've now released the button, but the game didn't poll for new inputs this time, yet it translates the inputs from the previous frame once more. This has the result of inputs acting as if they were being held down across the 2 frames, with no opportunity for a new input. So what's causing this? Turns out the game's logic to poll for new inputs is one of the last things done during a frame, and is located here within the last subroutine. The same subroutine for drawing a frame to the screen, which we've already determined is completely skipped when a frame is skipped. This results in the game processing inputs every frame, but doesn't poll for new inputs on skipped frames. And that confirms Maj and Dammit's theories about missed input opportunities on turbo speeds. So, did the Street Fighter seminar article posted on Capcom's site get it wrong? Was there maybe something lost in translation? I'm not quite sure, but let's wrap this up simply and demonstrate exactly how Alpha 2 runs while on turbo speeds. The sequence of events for a frame starts by checking if it needs to be skipped, processes the inputs and game logic, draws the frame to the screen, then lastly, it polls for any inputs that occurred since the last poll. An input was pressed and processed. The game draws the frame to the screen, then polls for any inputs that were pressed since the last poll, sends those inputs to the next frame to be translated and processed, and so on. But on a skipped frame, the inputs and game logic are processed, but it skips drawing the frame to the screen and skips polling for new inputs. Instead, it keeps the same inputs in memory, and the following frame processes them again. It then draws the frame to the screen and polls for any new inputs since the last input. This ensures no inputs are ever dropped, but not every internal frame gives an opportunity for new inputs. And that's how turbo speeds ultimately work. So what implications does this have on gameplay? Well, for starters, Anything that has a timing window of 1 frame won't be possible if it occurs during a frame skip. In a previous video of mine, I explored why it was so hard to reversal in Alpha 2. Part of the reason was the reversal window was a single frame. And from what we've just seen about turbo speeds, those reversals got even harder. Because on Turbo 2, they aren't even possible 25% of the time. Neither are the game's 1-frame links. Here's a recording of Chun-Li's 1-frame link of standing fierce into crouching forward. You can see it doesn't combo at times, because a frame skip denied the recording an input opportunity on the frame needed to land the link. Frame advantage is also affected. It reduces any advantage by a frame when a skip would occur on the first frame of recovery, but has no impact on attacks that are even. For example, Chun-Li's overhead is -1 on block, but a frame skip can make it even. This unpredictability may seem completely broken in a time where players are obsessed with precise frame data and balance patches. But turbo speeds were added to games of an era when the term frame data didn't even exist in the lexicon of the player base. When damage and stun values had randomized outcomes, and the loser of the first round was given a buff. When new tech was saved for the right moment, and your opponent learned of it via a different kind of tweet. These things gave Capcom fighting games character when you couldn't rely on frame precision to get you out of a bad situation, but rather, you just shouldn't have been there to begin with. Where playing from the heart with a read and a touch of luck was the advantage that actually mattered.
He wants to hit the button, dog!
Maybe that's why it's so interesting to me to dive in line by line and break these older games down decades later to unveil some of their mystique.